Let's talk naming conventions. What are naming conventions? Why do we use them? And how can we implement one? A naming convention is simply a set of rules that you have defined in how you name different things throughout your system. How you name your flows, how you name components in your flows, in your code. How do you name your Apex classes? It's just something predefined so that you know how you're supposed to name something. Why would we do that? Well, one of the biggest reasons for doing that is consistency and organization. First of all, let's talk about consistency. If you're using the naming convention and you're using it all over your system, then you have an easier time finding things that you have built. And anybody else working in your system or that may come into your system will have an easier time finding things that they need to find to be able to work with your system. It keeps it well organized, and it really saves you a lot of headaches of searching for things and trying to find where things are. So how do you come up with a naming convention? Well, that's really kind of up to you, and you're going to have to think about that and work through that with you and maybe your team. I'm going to give you some suggestions of a couple of naming conventions that I have used and continue to use on anything that I work with. The important part is to find a naming convention for your company and stick with it and teach it to your team. So I'm going to work with flows a little bit, and we're going to talk about naming flows and naming components in the flows to kind of help get you started with this a little bit. So when you're working with flows, I'm going to go ahead and hit new flow here. We're going to talk a little bit about this as part of the types of flows that we have, right? So we've got 6 main types of flows to deal with. When you're working with flows, and usually with code as well, most of the time your process that you're working on is going to be fired from a specific record from a specific object. Now, I know that's not 100% true, and so what the naming convention I'm about to propose to you may not fit every scenario. And you're going to find that as you create a naming convention. You're going to have situations where it just doesn't always fit, but that's okay. As you come across those, you can figure out how to name them so that they're easy to find and work with. So how do we come up with a name for our flow? Well, I'm going to start with a simple flow that is going to be fired from a lead. When certain criteria on the lead is met, we're going to set the status of the lead to working. Or maybe the status of the lead goes to nurturing or something like that. Basically, the point of the flow we're going to build is based on the criteria of the flow. We're going to set the status of the lead to something. So there's a couple of ways to go about that. So that means that I'm working with a record trigger flow because my criteria is going to be when this criteria is met on a record, we want to do something. So we're going to start with that. We're going to give it lead, created or updated for this scenario. I'm going to give it a couple of conditions. We're going to say if the title contains VP, I'm going to say email is no false, meaning we have an email. I'm going to do the same thing for phone number. And for phone, I'm actually going to use both the phone and the mobile phone for this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this custom logic, and I'm going to say it's 1 and 2 and either 3 or 4. So as long as this criteria is met, we're going to set the status of the flow, which means it's going to be a before save or a fast field update. I did not mean to check that box. There we go. And I only want to fire when I meet the criteria. I don't want to fire this every single time the record is touched. Okay, so I have the beginning of my flow. If anybody knows me, I don't like auto layout. That's my preference. Now I need to save it. So how do I name this flow? Well, for flows and for most Apex classes that I work with, I start with the name of the object and then a dash. If record types are in play, I'll put the name of the record type next, and I'll define the record type in the entry criteria as often as I can. In this case, I don't have record types in place, so I'm not going to worry about that. So once you've got that set, then it's just a matter of describe the flow. In this case, I'm just going to say set the status, and I'm going to give it a description. The correct data is entered. Set this status of the lead. Thank you, spell checker. And we'll save it. So now we've got our name for our flow. So that's the basic naming convention for my flows. Object name, record type name, and then a quick description of the flow. Now you want to be careful not to make your names too long, because that just becomes cumbersome and hard to read when you're in the list where you've got minimal space. So come up with some sort of name that describes the function of your flow very quickly. Okay? Now, my criteria is pretty simple here. If the title contains VP, I have an email, and I have one of the phone numbers. The point of this one is I simply want to set my status to working. And you're going to see I'm doing an assignment. Now, this is a before save flow, so you have two ways to set this status. You can use an assignment. Because it's a before save, we're working with the record before it's committed to the database. Assignments actually apply directly to your record. You could also use the update record element, which I usually use myself, but it doesn't matter. Either one does the same thing in this scenario. As you'll see, the way I labeled this, and again, this is preference, but all of my elements in a flow start the same way. If it's an assignment, I start with assign and then describe what I'm assigning. If it's a decision, I ask a question. If it's a get records, I say get and then the object I'm looking up. And sometimes I have to get multiple records from the same object, and so I'll put another little description on it afterwards. The point is come up with a naming convention and keep it consistent, right? That's the point of what you want to do. Okay, so it's a record trigger flow, so we have the standard or global record variable. I'm going to set the status to working. I don't have the status I actually want because this is a new system, but we're going to go with that. And connect it, and there we go. Okay, let's go back. We're going to grab a different flow here. I'm going to grab this reset password flow. This is a screen flow. Screen flows are a little different. Sometimes screen flows are called from a specific record. Sometimes they're not. They're more generic. So naming screen flows can be a little bit harder, but the same concept applies. If it's fired from a specific place, use that as the beginning of your name, and then describe what it does. Now I'm grabbing this one because it's got some things already built into it to kind of show you some of this that we're going to work with. So if we look at this flow and we look at the manager here, you'll see it's got a lot of things in it. There's somewhat of a naming convention going on. We've got screen components, we've got email information, name information. We've got some stages, we've got some templates, and a whole bunch of standard variables. I'll use another video and go into variables and using data variables versus record variables more often. for the purpose of this, I am going to do a little bit of work on this flow just to kind of show you a little bit more about naming conventions and how to work with them real quick here. So right off the bat, I see I've got a couple of get contact elements and a get case. I'm going to start with the contact elements. I'm going to come right here. And I need some data off the contact, but this is just putting it in a standard data variable, and I would rather use a record variable for this. So I'm going to create a new record variable. Now, as you're working with these variables, let me just kind of explain some of my naming conventions inside of flows that helps keep things a little bit organized. So variables have multiple data types, and depending on the data type is what determines how I name it. If it's going to be a record variable, I'll do SO or SOC for a collection and the name of the object. If it's going to be text, I'll do var. And that also goes for text, currencies, numbers, booleans, dates, things like that. Pick lists, I'll generally actually do pick instead of var to separate those a little bit, just because the way they work is a little different. But for the most part, my variables are pretty simple. It's either var or so or pick, depending on the data type being used. And then the name of the object or the field or whatever it is that you're working with after that. Another one is formulas. I use formulas a lot in flows, and they always start with FOR, and then the field or the main function of the formula. So if I'm using a formula that's going to have a case statement in it, maybe I'm using a formula that's dependent on the status of the lead will determine another value. So I would do for lead status tells me I'm going to be setting the lead status based on this formula, or for lead date, I'm going to be setting the date on the lead. Anyway, that's kind of the standard that I like to use there. So there you go. Naming conventions, they're really critical. If you don't think it's critical, then I'll leave that up to you. You're welcome to comment and share your thoughts and opinions about it. But really, if you have a good solid naming convention, you're going to have a cleaner system. You're going to have an easier time working with it. And I hope this is helpful. If you like this video series, subscribe to the channel. We'll talk more about different tech tips and how to help you set up your system. Bye for now.